Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lunchalytics 2 in Calgary. Thankfully, y'all made it out. We have a full house, so I think even the seats that are facing the wrong way will be filled up by the time everyone arrives. Just a little bit of background about Lunchalytics. This has been going on in Edmonton for about 4 years. Done 30-odd events up there. The whole idea, though, is to grow the community. We want to grow the community of people who create analytics for a living, and the community of people who consume analytics for a living, and perhaps even the academics and students who are doing research in analytics. And we want to kind of throw them in a bowl and shake them up and see what comes out, but we want the bowl to get bigger and bigger. So our whole hope, our whole goal behind this is to, like I said, grow the community. And if you want to take part in helping to grow the community, we are looking for volunteers to help coordinate events, to help find speakers, to help find sponsors, and so forth. On that note, I want to thank Deloitte Consulting. They are the sponsor for this particular event. Is there anyone here from Deloitte besides Jeffrey? Well, let's just give a hand to Deloitte. And you're welcome to say a few words about Deloitte as well. I know Jeffrey is going to be speaking on artificial intelligence in just a moment. One last question before we kick it off, though. How many of you here are what you would consider consumers of analytics? You make decisions based on analysis that other people do for you. So raise your hand if you're a decision maker. It's okay, wave around. Yeah, so there's a few of you. So I'd say about a quarter of the audience. How many of you are creators or producers of analysis and analytics? Okay, so we're a little more weighted that side. How many of you are academics or students or that type? Okay, not very, a handful of those. Excellent. Our first contestant is Naomi Esfahani. She's with Suncor Energy, a senior market analyst there. She is going to be talking to us about energy analytics, which is a great topic. So without further ado, Naomi, welcome and take it away.
Thank you for the intro. So this is Naomi Esfahani, and I am a senior market analyst with Market Analysis and Research Team that's part of the Supply Trading and Optimization Organization at SOR Ratio. Today, and because this is a lunch and learn on energy analytics, I thought I would showcase a few areas, and these are, obviously, yeah.
Use the, I think the mic there.
You want to use the mic.
Yeah, we can't quite hear it. But, yeah.
Do you have one of those?
Where's Greg?
Yeah,
it's on.
I'll try to just use this.
Start it. Yeah.
Awesome. So basically, I wanted to sort of showcase a few examples of where analytics are used in energy and commodity space, and I wanted to focus a little more on my area of coverage, which is essentially a market analysis and research within crude oil trading. Really the purpose of market analysis and research is really in commodities space is understanding of fundamentals of the market. And by that we mean the forces of supply and demand, and how supply gets to demand through basically trade flows and infrastructure that basically accommodates that kind of flow from the supply nodes to demand nodes. So understanding of pipelines, tanker movements, and storage, and all of that. And ultimately, the end goal is to forecast oil prices or commodities prices. And one thing we all know about forecasts is they're always wrong. So perfect, right? That we're spending all of this time and effort doing all of this work to forecast prices, and we don't get much value out of it, but that's not true. The trends very much show up in this kind of analysis, and those trends are a lot easier to see than forecasting actual prices, and those trends become the basis for making a lot of major decisions within commodity producing community. So, and ultimately after covering those two concepts, I'll just highlight a few cases where a lot of intellectual manpower basically sits within supply and trading organizations. So what are commodity fundamentals? Today, and by today I really mean 2017 average, we are consuming about 97.5 million barrels a day of oil and liquids. And that comes from, and where that comes from is essentially 4 major regions within the world that produce about almost 75% of total supply. Supply is a bit, was a bit higher than demand in 2017, about 97.8 million barrels per day, and those are estimates. And if you ask, well, where does the extra crude go? Most of that goes into storage. Now, why do we produce more than what we need every year? That's essentially a function of the free markets. Production is an action that is uncoordinated between different regions. So if there are incentives for producers to produce crude from different regions, and there's prices that incent those, a lot of people would go after producing more crude. And a few years later, you have all of this supply, and and that will start to add into a lot of issues and bottlenecks around infrastructure, pipeline limitations, and so forth, and storage running out of capacity, that kind of stuff, and that results into in a price crash. And obviously consumers love this, right? Because they see oil prices and gasoline and diesel prices very low, and they go after buying a lot more of it versus what they used to. And this is what we call in economic terms elasticity of demand. So there's more demand that is incented by low prices of commodities, and also producers respond to this kind of price crash by cutting back on capital spends in basically their long-term capital investments. And basically what that does over time is it balances the market. And this, in essence, drives what we call economic cycles in the commodities space, or commodity cycles. Now, let's look at these producing regions, OPEC, and I have this big red bubble in Middle East, basically, but there are more than just the Middle East that are covered under OPEC. They produce about 40% of total supply globally, and another 35% is basically produced between North America, that's US and Canada, and Russia. And the rest, about 25%, is produced in the rest of the world. Now, this is a quiz. Who knows which of these countries is the world's largest producer of crude oil? And those are US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Who says Saudi Arabia? Russia? US? Correct. And yes, US today is actually the largest producer of liquids. And if I asked you the same question last year, that would have been a different answer. Last year, Russia and Saudi Arabia were sort of competing with each other, producing more at times and less at other times. But 2017 is sort of when US's total production ramped up and now is exceeding. And going into the following years, it would be the main producer of, the largest producer of, as a country, of all liquids. Now we talked about where supply comes from. On the demand, it's a very different story. Demand is not concentrated. In fact, more than half of total world demand is actually consumed by non-OECDs, which are countries that are underdeveloped or developing. Those are China, India, and a lot of Middle East and those kind of countries. And almost about 47% is consumed in the developed world. Now, to give you a little bit of perspective, about 25% of total liquids is consumed in North America. And North America basically houses about 5% of total population in globally. So 25% of total liquids are consumed here. And the next region that consumes highest after North America is Europe. And they consume almost as half, probably a little more. They're having more or less about 5 to 6% of global population. And then Asia, about 60% of global population today consumes about 35% of total liquid demand. Now, sort of looking at this, I'm thinking what could happen in the future. The demographics have a very clear story, right? So we're going to have a lot lower, basically aging, and a lot of the developed countries speeding up from here, and population growth in the non-OECD or developing countries. So you can imagine this chart will look like a lot higher bar on the non-OECD versus the OECD. So from here, we're going to see declines of demand within the developed countries, offset by growing demand within the non-OECD. As a whole, we think the world is going to grow demand for the next 10, 15 years, and from there, we're going to see sort of slow down or decline in the global demand. Now, because of the mismatch between the supply region and demand region, you start to see basically trade and trade flow sort of developing over time. And that's partly because of where supply regions are, but also partly because there is a mismatch between the refining complexes and the kind of crude that they can take to process in its refineries versus what is available locally. So that drives some of the trades, and also seasonality of demand. So there's always uptick or downtick on refining utilization and outages and so forth, and that also basically results in trades that are basically import and export needs. So within these regions, you sort of see OPEC is a big supplier of oil that sends a lot of oil to North and Asia because it's quite proximate to India and China of the world, and also the rest of Asia, and also especially countries like Saudi Arabia send a lot of crude to Eastern Canada and US. Russia sends a lot of crude to Europe. Also, OPEC supplies Europe as well. West Africa sends a lot of crude to Eastern Canada and US. And also Latin America is a big supplier of crude to sort of North American continent. And now more recently, we've started to see flows out of US into Latin America and also into Europe. Why do you think it's actually reasonable to see flow of crude into and out of US into Latin America, based on everything I said? Any ideas? Louder? No, it has to do with
It's a refinery mismatch issue.
exactly.
It's a heavy refining capacity in the US, but they produce light oil for their shales.
Exactly. So this is essentially a lot of that has to do with swapping of grades, and we'll talk about quality in crude oil, which is different from a lot of other commodities. Most commodities are treated homogeneous, but crudes are very different in that no two crudes are the same. In fact, we have every hole you dig in the ground and every region that you look into producing oil will produce a different type of crude. And they're all sort of different from each other. In Western Canada, we're marketing over 25 different grades of crude. And high level, we have basically 3 big categories of crude. Those are light sweet, medium sour, and heavy sour crudes that are generally marketed in the world. And to be able to process each of those crudes, refining complexes need certain equipment and processing capabilities, which does not exist everywhere in the world. Now, talking about Canada, this is a very special story, Canada, because most of the producing regions have access to water. With Canada, there's very limited capacity to waters, and a lot of flows, essentially exports, happen between Canada and US, and that is not even covering all of the US. Historically, most of the crude that leaves Western Canada goes into PAD 2, and what we really mean is Midwestern area, Chicago and Detroit area, and they take a lot of crude from Western Canada. And more recently, we've been sending more crude down to US Gulf Coast and Texas area where there is a big refining complex sitting there. And there are efforts to sort of send the crude to Eastern Canada. We know how hard that is, right? But with pipeline limitations out of Western Canada, and if you know anything about marketing, having one big consumer who has optionality to get crude from other parts of the world, what that means is that Western Canada crude is undervalued, basically. So you have one customer that is willing to take your crude, and there's a lot of supply out of Western Canada. And bottlenecks out of Western Canada will essentially result in capacity limitations. So another reason that Western Canada crude does get discounted is quality. We actually produce lower grade quality of crude versus most crudes that are produced elsewhere. And this basically sort of shows if, in fact, Western Canada cost of supply, because of the realized price is so low, is so high that if you stack all of the projects within the globe and looked at sort of the potential to produce different volumes versus what makes those projects economic, measured in Brent break-even equivalent. These charts, by the way, are called cost curves, and they're very popular in fundamental analysis. And what they show is how much could become available at what price of Brent, given different parts of different geologies and different break-even economics in the world. And this is Canada oil sands. So you can see sort of around. So basically, what this says is, if the price of Brent was $40 a barrel, we could make economics of about 6 million barrels a day of crude production out of Middle East economic, if there were no other constraints, geopolitically or others. And this is sort of the bottom range of where Western Canada actually requires for some SAGD type projects to make those even start to go around. And but you see what that does to the rest of the world. It also makes a lot of other resources economic. And so what that really tells you is, by the time we get in the money to produce in Western Canada, there's a lot of other production coming from the rest of the world. And and obviously, the higher the demand, the more crude is required by the globe to be consumed. The more resources need to be developed, and the higher the price, the break-even price of that supply. And so, what that really tells you is the basis of our long-term forecast for Brent is essentially based on the long-term demand on each of these projects. Now, because I'm running out of time, basically what I wanted to discuss here was sort of price mechanisms and pricing that is essentially more relevant to supply and trading and optimization organizations. Basically, forecasting of flat prices, essentially like Brent or WTI prices, are quite a bit complicated and very influenced by the short-term fundamentals of the market. What is really important for a lot of organizations is the differentials, the location differentials, and quality differentials. And to understand how that works, you really need to look at how the marginal barrel out of a province clears, basically, and sort of the mechanism around clearing of that marginal barrel. So let's say we are a producer in Western Canada, and we have access to two demand regions. Those are in Chicago and Cushing, and we have pipeline capacity, and these are all capacities of the pipeline, and the cost associated with sending barrels per barrel to those different regions. To simplify the problem, I've given the prices of the purchase prices in those two markets. If I am a producer in Western Canada, what I want to do is to basically realize the highest netback. So the price that I get in any of those markets, less the transport cost, and see the highest price that I can realize from the options that I have. So if I have a supply, obviously looking at this, you kind of see 60 minus 3 gives you a highest than $57 in net back for Western Canada. Here, 61 minus 4.5 gives you about 50 cents less in net back. So you would be your optimal choice to send your crude is on this black pipeline to Chicago. But that pipeline has a capacity limitation, right? If supply exceeds 200,000 barrels a day out of Western Canada, then the rest of that supply needs to go on one of these other routes to go into either the same market or a different market. And that other route it looks like to be this one, which is about 50 cents higher cost, basically for the producer to send it down to this market. So the price in Western Canada now is 50 cents lower. And how about the first tranche of supply that actually made it to Chicago through this pipeline? Well, they realized a higher value for their product. When the price was 50 cents lower, they actually realized a higher value for having access to that route versus all other routes out of Western Canada. Now, if you go through, the more we produce in Western Canada of supply, the more we start to sort of saturate these markets and fill all of those access pipelines. And at one point, we exceed capacity out of Western Canada. And so at this point, where does the crude go? If we start producing more than 750,000 barrels a day in Western Canada, then the price has to go low enough for storage in the area to start taking your barrels. And what if storage is full? Then you start to see a situation where you have to price even lower for producers to essentially shut in their wells and shut in production. And that is the kind of severe conditions that we actually live in today in Western Canada. If you have seen the announcements last week, Cenovus basically announced that they're going to shut in some of their production because of exact same situation that you see here. Now, I will leave you with this. This is essentially what I just explained, a sort of pricing mechanism for crude. But we actually, what a producer realizes is not even location diffs. They actually get not only, they can realize the Chicago price, what they actually sell in Western Canada is lower quality, so they get a quality adjustment on top of that. And in Western Canada, what most people produce is not a WCS type crude where there's a benchmark for it. They actually produce what is called dilbit, which is essentially bitumen blended with diluent, which is purchased at a higher price than the blended barrel from the market and sold at a lower blend. So what the producer actually realizes is once taking deblending and taking the cost out of what they've actually paid for diluent, what is remained is what they realize in Western Canada for bitumen value. And that is what drives the economics in Western Canada for projects. With that, I will hand it over to the next.
Sure, yeah, time for one question.
Yeah. What is the red number? What are people realizing as far as bitumen values?
So what bitumen value, realization value is essentially a WCS minus dilbit quality discount to WCS. So that is composed of two different discounts. One is heavy high TAN discount. One is sort of a quality for low TAN dilbit discount. So a cold lake discount to WCS would be a low TAN discount of dilbit to WCS, which is about $2, generally $2 to $3, depending on the market. And then there's a TAN discount on top of that. So for a heavy high TAN bitumen value, you would get a blended barrel heavy high 10 dilbit value from those discounts, and then you would deblend it to take about 35%, 33 to 35% of the barrel, which is filled with diluent out. The rest, and then it's normalized to a barrel and that's what I meant by deblending economics, essentially deblending to get back to what you realize. There's no market for bitumen, right? Your valuation for bitumen is all theoretical based on what you could sell your blended bitumen in the market as a differential to WCS. Does that answer your question?
What, in today's world, what dollar is that per barrel?
That really depends on which market you're selling in. Some producers are realizing as low as $5 a barrel. If Cenovus is shutting in, that means they can't cover their operating costs, which is pretty low. So what they're producing is probably, what they can get for those specific barrels is probably lower. But it really depends on, this is another complication with what you can realize in the non-cycle versus the spot, basically spot market. So it could range from anywhere from $15, $17 a barrel down to $5, $6, and probably sometimes negative, depending on the diluent you're actually planning to put into your barrel.
All right, well, thanks very much. And our next speaker is, who's our next speaker? Jeff Can from Deloitte is going to be shifting gears and talking about artificial intelligence and actual practical case studies of where artificial intelligence has been used in oil and gas. So without further ado, Jeffrey Can, partner with Deloitte. Turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon and taking this all in. The time of year, with Easter and so forth, it's means to the opportunity to learn a little bit about this particular topic is taking away from what I hope is a sprint to get yourself out of the office on Thursday afternoon at 5. Someone, my spouse pointed out to me, I have to use ask my wife to review my work, and she said, that looks like someone's sticking pins into an eyeball. Is that really what you intended? And I said, no, because this isn't a lecture on accounting. Sorry, George. I just had to say that because I know you're going to go. I don't give out my phone number anymore because the world's gone on to many other mechanisms to reach people. But if you want to follow me or track me down, it's Jeffrey Can, and I can be found at any of those addresses. I wrote a weekly article series on the impact of digital on oil and gas. There's 70-odd articles in there, including this particular presentation is built up of 4 articles I've written on where I see artificial intelligence playing a role in oil and gas. The reason I wanted to share these stories with you was because these are real-life examples, and therefore they've been slightly de-risked. That is, if you were to take some of these ideas inside your own company, you could probably find a fertile audience. People would be interested in hearing about this because other oil and gas companies have already moved on these concepts and ideas. So in oil and gas, the saying is the early bird gets the worm, of course, but its second mouse gets the cheese. And by that I mean the second oil and gas company feels better about prosecuting good ideas because the first oil company's already gone through and made all the mistakes. So good ideas that you can prosecute in your organizations are higher value because they have higher prospectivity in terms of success. So let's talk about 4 use cases. This one, and I use these are hand-drawn cartoons that I prepare. The reason is one, Deloitte's too cheap to pay for anyone to actually do real graphics, but 2, it's different. And so if you want to be different, one of the ways to do it is to draw your own artwork. This one is, this use case is on visual data. Oil and gas industry does not generally rely on cameras and visuals with artificial intelligence engines to read data and take an action. But this is changing, and this particular use case comes from a couple of oil and gas concerns here in Calgary who have mounted cameras on fixed locations. They aim them at a specific, where what we would call in the industry a bad actor or a big piece of facility that is, say, prone to mishap, or maybe emitting more than its share of methane. And the purpose of that camera is to capture that data. And because the data, the imagery has been fed through an artificial intelligence engine, the engine can look at the data and take an action. So what kind of action might that be? Well, there's a cow at the gate. Do you open the gate or not? How do you tell the difference between a cow and a human? So humans can do that easily, but using visual analytics, the camera can now look at the gate and say, well, that's a cow or a deer, or it's a service technician. Open the gate, please. Why is this important? Because a human staring at a camera can only look at one or maybe 4 or 5 at a time, maybe, and you're going to miss what's happening on some of those monitors, whereas a computer can monitor hundreds and hundreds and hundreds at exactly the same time. And the cost differential is huge. So think $25 to $50 an hour for a human operator to supervise 1 to 3 camera screens, whereas the visual analytics engines can do all of that for about 25 cents a screen, 25 cents a camera. So the cost is extraordinary, it's huge. So aside from this activity of just supervising gates, what else could you do with a camera if you aimed it at the right location at an oil and gas infrastructure? Well, you could detect whether or not someone is wearing the right safety gear and avoid a health and safety incident. You can intercept someone who's smoking because the camera can pick up the presence of a cigarette and to send an alert to the supervisor to say, heads up, your crew is about to go into a facility, one of them is smoking. You can monitor certain hazards, certainly when wind conditions pick up. And of course, very useful for incident research and follow-up. Why is this relevant? Huge cost savings is really the main driver. And it's great that Naomi went first. Thank you so much, because what Naomi did is she painted for us all, in case the math is a trick to get into. The value of North American oil production for us, north of the 49th parallel, our costs are much higher than south of the border. And so anything that we can do to get our costs down is a welcome in the industry. Notwithstanding, we still have to get access to market, because access is one of our biggest issues. But setting that aside, if we can get the cost of oil and gas production down, good things will happen. Now, what are these cameras able to do these days? Well, they can actually look at a steam plume coming out of an asset, and while the human eye can't see the difference between what's in the steam plume, the camera can pick out how much methane is coming out of that steam plume. And in a province that has a megaton cap on carbon emissions, specifically GHGs, but methane, which is much more serious, that's a big plus. So this technology adds to that particular visual analytics is a real up-and-coming technology. And because of its low cost and rapidly falling costs, becoming more and more economic for all kinds of applications. Next one I want to talk about is the creation of the digital twin. So a digital twin is when you build your asset for a specific facility. You might think of an LNG facility in British Columbia, or an oil refinery. A digital twin is where you build a mathematical model of your plant in the cloud. And because it's very easy to play with the model and tune the business than it is to play with a real refinery in real life. And that's because they run 24/7 and you can't actually tamper with them once they get up and running. But the digital twin is a real up-and-coming asset. One of the LNG projects in British Columbia has told me that they built a digital version of the LNG plant before they will even build the plant. So they know in quite a level of precision exactly how the facility is going to be run, long before they pour any cement in the ground to actually build the asset. So if any of you are in organizations that have physical assets, the construction of a digital version of those assets in the cloud is now a very, very strong, powerful use case for analytics and artificial intelligence. Why would you do this? Well, the complexity of trying to make certain kinds of choices, and that pipeline infrastructure actually that Naomi showed was a great example of this. How do you make in-the-moment choices about sending a tanker's load of oil from this location to this location? And the analytics in behind that, the creation of that digital model are the way you actually do that. But what happens when you tie renewable power supply, which is you need the power to run the pumps? What happens when you tie renewable power, which has different pricing than, say, fossil fuel-based power, and you use that to make a different decision? Do I send it this way or this way because my costs might be different? The complexity of the math outstrips the human to be able to do that without sophisticated analytics and to allow those kinds of choices to be made. And so second big use case is this. And so if you're hearing this in your organization, digital twin, this is what you want to think about. You bring the financial costs of those assets, supply and demand curves, operating constraints, capital constraints, and the performance of those assets under real world conditions. You run multiple millions and millions of models of this, and that's what gives the operators guidance around how to actually run those assets in the moment. If you're interested in a real company that does this, you could look up Stream Systems here in Calgary. Stream runs digital twins and digital versions of network assets. A network asset could be a pipeline, tank farm, renewable power supplies, and so forth. All right, third use case. Anybody recognize that logo?
Watson.
It's Watson, yes. So the early pioneer of this is a company called Woodside in Australia. From 2012 to 2016, I lived and worked in Australia with the LNG industry. Woodside runs an offshore LNG facility called Northwest Shelf. It was built in 1989. So from 1989 to 2017, you can imagine how many engineering studies they would have run against that plant. Thousands and thousands and thousands of engineering studies. Many of the engineers that did those studies long since retired. So how do you capture, retain, and then make sure you can leverage that enormous base of intellectual research and property associated with researching every imaginable pump, blowout preventer and failure, every storm? How do you retain all of that knowledge so that every subsequent engineer can take full advantage of all of that work? So what Woodside's done is they fed in 20 plus years of engineering studies into IBM Watson, and then the engineers simply ask natural language questions in all of the nuanced language patterns that you see in English. And Watson very quickly, like seconds, goes through the millions and millions of documents, summarizes them in rank order of which ones most likely hit the topic, and presents those back to the engineers so that they don't have to spend as much of their time searching for content. How much engineering time do engineers at Woodside spend searching for engineering documents, you might ask? Because that's one of the big prizes. As much as 40% of their time was spent trying to find the bloody document. Okay? So Watson takes 40%, gives back to the oil and gas industry 40% of the engineering time. Okay? That's a huge, huge prize. Because the last time I met an engineer, they said to me, I'd rather be engineering than being a librarian. And Watson is one of the tools for doing that. If you want to see this in action, you can find it on YouTube. Deloitte uses this in Europe. We fed all of the case law into Watson for value-added tax. This is goods and services tax, or GST, as we call it here. In Europe, if you want to send cheese from France to Germany, if it's been pasteurized or unpasteurized, it might have a different GST rate. Who knows? So before you send your cheese from France to Germany, you might want to know, how much tax am I going to pay? And if I object to that tax, what is the likelihood the tax authority is going to give me the lower tax rate? To normally get that answer, you have to talk to lawyers or tax people. What we did was we fed in all these tax rules and adjudications into Watson, and now you can just ask Watson, I'm sending an unpasteurized blue cheese from France to Germany, what's my likely tax rate? If I took this case to the tax authorities, would they give me a break on taxes? You can now ask that kind of question to Watson. Now, inside oil and gas, there are lots and lots of examples of intellectual property, research studies, and so forth that Watson could play a significant role in. Okay, last use cases is in operations. A couple of examples here. So, anyone here, if everyone's familiar with SAGD operations? SAGD, yeah, steam assisted gravity drainage. So for those of you who are not, one of the ways you extract bitumen from the ground is that you inject steam into the oil deposit underground, and the steam heats up the oil. And much the same way as if you heated up molasses or honey, it will flow much more easily. Same effect with bitumen. If you heat it up, it will flow to the surface more easily. But the problem is those wells are very finicky. They clog easily. It's really unsure how much steam you should put down. Sometimes you put steam down and you only get water back. You don't get any oil back. Sometimes the steam from one well is impacting the steam with another well. This is a real complicated area, and at least one oil company is currently studying how to apply artificial intelligence to this problem. You need a lot of data, of course, for this to actually work. So fortunately, the industry's been in operations long enough now that this is now there's enough data piled up out there that we can actually do this. So what this is doing is providing predictive ability on the performance of those wells, so that the engineers can adjust the amount of steam that goes into the wells to extract the maximum amount of production. Back to our cost curve. Again, it was good order that we did this in this order. Remember how the costs for our oil deposits were so high? One of the reasons is to get bitumen out of the ground with steam, you have to spend a lot of money to turn water into steam, right? That's your first problem. You burnt a lot of water to make steam. You send the steam underground, and then you have to wait months and months and months before the steam has warmed up the deposit sufficiently. So that's very, very costly. Anything you can do to improve the steam performance of oil and gas changes our cost profile and makes more oil into the mine. Second use case on this is in predictive asset management and maintenance. Alistair, I know you and I were talking about this earlier, but predictive asset management and maintenance, really, really important. So other oil and gas companies, because of so much data now over the years has been piling up, that we are able to, using artificial intelligence, predict when wells and well facilities are going to clog up. And the reason why we do that is that you can either wait for the asset to fail, which is very expensive, because then now you're rushing around trying to get it back into production. You can schedule maintenance. I'm going to go every Thursday and fix this well. Or you can use AI to say, we're pretty sure the well is going to fail next Tuesday. Why don't you go in and do your cleanup on Monday? So now we get into predictive maintenance to be able to predict when the well is going to fail using artificial intelligence. This is one of the new use cases. Okay. So these are all live. They're all in oil and gas. They're all real. They all have reference sites. They're therefore partially de-risked. And so if you're in the world of trying to or helping your organization apply analytics in a creative way, there's 4 use cases that you can take to the bank. That's it.
Time for 1 or 2 questions. Jeffrey? You covered it so well. I have a question.
Fire away.
How much value is at stake, say, with the adjusting the steam and so forth in a SAGD system?
So as Naomi pointed out, not all oil is the same. So if you go underground and you look at my bitumen resource versus your resource, they might be quite different. And so in the industry, the amount of steam you have to put in per barrel is called the steam oil ratio, or the SOR. How much steam or water per barrel of production. The best producers are in the 3 range, and the ones with the hardest rocks that have the most work are in the 8 range. So if you take a barrel of oil, anybody here cook at home and you know what it takes to heat up a pot of water, imagine heating a barrel of oil to steam, right? It's lots and lots of money. So if you're at 8, if you can move that down to 7.5 or 7, you make a big difference on your economics.
All right. Thanks very much. Again, I believe Jeffrey will be sticking around at least a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
If you'd like to ask him questions in person. As Craig sets up, Craig Schramm is our 3rd speaker. He's with Carmen Velasquez. So this is a joint. Did I pronounce your name right?
No.
Carmen and Craig are going to be talking, referencing the work done by Naomi, I think, or at least riffing off of that. Craig is with Dark Horse Analytics, and Carmen is with the University of Alberta A center with a lot of acronym, long name.
Yes, like a university.
A typical university. So I'll leave it to the two of you. Are you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right. Take a look.
Yeah, so this is actually, the order is perfect because we get to close it off today. And we're gonna talk about two things. So one is kind of how Kerrigan and I came to this point of building this model together. And then we're gonna give you an example, or we're gonna show you more about what the model is. So as Naomi has pointed out, and as Jeff pointed out, nothing speaks volumes about why we need a pipeline than looking at the price map every day. So we publish at the university a weekly report, and you can see, ignoring all the bitumen valley stuff, Western Canadian Select lately is at $36.60, and the rest of the world is around $60. Okay, so we are significantly behind, as she has pointed out. It's not pipeline economics, it's not rail economics, it's not storage economics, it is in fact shut-in economics for some of the companies. And so when I talked to, so Craig was my client when I was with a big consulting company, and he used to be with the Alberta government. And we got together now in these roles, and we said, hey, you know what, I think there's a real demand to understand more about the transportation and understanding costs and differentials, looking on a forward basis. And I know this is what Suncor would be doing within their trading organization, but we said, what about on a longer term basis? There's a lot of people, or there's some people that publish this information, but they don't give you a lot of their transparent assumptions that they've made. And I think that's actually really critical if you're going to believe someone when they're saying, you know, we're losing this much every day, or this is what the differential will be in the future, then all of that matters. And the other thing is when we look forward, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So this is the International Energy Agency Oil 2018 report that was published just on March 5th, so very recently. And it shows a huge thing that's happening. So if I can summarize the report for you in one sentence, the important part for me was that 80% of the world's demand growth from now to 2023 is going to be met by US production. 80% of the growth, that's amazing. So that's how much we think US will continue to grow. And the remaining 20% will be met by Canada, Norway, and Brazil. And so what this chart is showing is basically relative to today, what they think the change is going to be in flows. So today, North America imports, it says 3 million barrels a day. We think by 2023, at least the IEA thinks, it will be 500,000 barrels per day, which is huge. And then where's that oil going to go? Quite a bit of it's going to go to Europe. So they're importing today 10, that's going to drop to 9. We do have decline in some of the areas. Africa is going to decline, Latin America is going to decline, but you've got this huge growth still in Asia, as Naomi's pointed out, that's expected to continue. And in this, what it assumes that the Middle East stays constant, which I find really interesting, because at Zero Week 2 weeks ago, one of the things that the energy minister said from OPEC, he said, the irony is not lost on us that the US is producing this much because OPEC has cut production. And so it is really interesting to think forward, what's going to happen? Is OPEC just happy to stay at producing 20 and then having the US then fill all the gaps, which is kind of what we're seeing happen today. So we look at that and we think, okay, well, what's going to happen with that? And then we've got this picture, and this is from June of 2017, so new report will come out. But what it shows is that Canada's expectation, and the IEA says this too, is we do have continual growth in production. So even with the lower price, we are still expecting some projects to move ahead and will continue to grow. So then what do? As we pointed out, we have market access issues. And even from CAP's last report, I did have to put an X through the Energy East project because that's no longer going ahead. So today we're staying in a world with Keystone XL, maybe, TMX, maybe, and we've got line 3 replacement from Enbridge, right? And so these are the options we have. And the other option we have in the meantime is rail. So we are expecting, I think the market is expecting that rail is going to continue to grow. So we look at this and we think, okay, what does this mean for everything? So one of the things we talked about is, can we develop a network flow model to try and predict the flows, understanding the constraints, understanding heavy light, understanding refinery mismatch, all of these concepts, and try to figure out where will crude go, how much more will be exported, what will that look like, and therefore what will differentials look like in the future. So that's my setup, and now you get to hear about the model.
Cool. So I'm Craig, and I work with Dark Horse Analytics, and as Carmen said, she used to tell me what I should think, and now we're figuring out what we should all think. So originally, I titled this presentation a model of crude oil trade, but a colleague was like, I have a way better idea. So I'm going to present on my crude model of oil trade. It was crude at the beginning. It's actually kind of complicated now, but I'll make it look easy. Okay, so we wanted to come up with a model to evaluate a couple of different things. This also is a perfect setup from Naomi, so thank you. So first we wanted to know, obviously, what would the effect of changes in pipeline infrastructure be on crude oil markets? So say we build a pipeline or we don't build any pipelines, what can we expect to happen in terms of trade flows? We want to know as more refining capacity is built or if it's shut down, how that might affect trade flows, how it might affect prices. That's demand. And then on the supply side, if there's ever a shortfall in supply, say if there's a fire in northern Alberta, how might that affect trade flows in North America? And last but not least, we wanted a model on which we could put together some sort of forecast for the future. Whether it's right or wrong is a whole other thing. Actually, forecasts are always wrong. Is that what you said?
Almost always.
Almost always. If they're not, it's a secret. So I'm going to explain how we set up this model. So the first thing that we do is we divide North America into these regions. So for Canada, we have the West Coast. We have Western Canada, which is, most of the left side. And then we have Central Canada and, of course, the East Coast. And then in the US, we divide it into its 5 petroleum administrative defense districts. In fact, in our model itself, we subdivide PAD 2 into North, Mid, and South. Sort of the, where the pipelines come in, where it's processed here, and Cushing, for those of you that are familiar with this stuff. So we divide it into regions, and then if we want to model, we need a couple things in each of those regions. So we need the supply of oil that comes into each of those regions. And in fact, we want that by grade in this case. So we just do light and heavy. It's 2 commodities. As well, we want to know what the demand for each of those grades is in each one of these nodes. So we have those 2 pieces of information. Some of that we get from CAP, some of that we get from the EIA, of course. If we want to know something about trade, then we need to know about how oil goes between each one of these nodes. So we need to know what the pipeline capacity is between each one of these regions. So we spent a great deal of time looking at pipeline capacity, connecting all of these nodes. It's very time consuming. Luckily, we have, courtesy of Carmen at the university, occasionally some summer students that can do some of the nasty work for us. But of course, oil doesn't only move by pipeline, it can also move by rail or tanker and barge. So we need to know something about the rail connections between each of these nodes, and we also want to know something about how it moves along the water. And last but not least, we know that North America is not a closed system, so we also need to know something about the capacity to import and export from sort of the main ports in our large region here. And so then we have all of that information, and so we need to optimize, and my question to everyone is, how do we optimize trade flows? What are we trying to do? What is this problem trying to optimize? Any guesses?
Never.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, but we're actually looking at sort of an industry level profit is how we choose our flows in this model. So we set up this model, we got all of our pipeline information, we got all of our costs and our capacities, and we decided to compare it to reality, which is actually really, really hard because all of the public data that we can compare against is not the same resolution. So we're looking at light and heavy barrels traveling between all of those nodes, and we subdivide PAD 2, but when we try and get data from the EIA, they just tell us the amount of oil that goes from point A to point B. So we have a lot of arcs in our network when you compare it to the data that we can get. So we had to come up with a bit of a fancy way to compare. So we've done it a couple times. This is 2015, and this is the actual flow. And I use the term actual very loosely because as we've found out very recently, we were having trouble comparing our fit. And one of the reasons is that the data, I guess it's free, so you get what you pay for, but the EIA data didn't make a lot of sense. So we were trying to compare our model to reality, and we're saying, oh, it's not fitting, oh, it's not fitting. And in these network flow models, one of the constraints is that everything, like the inflows to a region must be equal to the outflows to a region. So barrels can't appear or disappear. And when you look at the EIA data, in recent time for pad 3, that was off by about 1 million barrels per day. Well, throw that into a model that we're trying to get to work, and that's a lot of oil to try and account for by correcting some errors. So we sent them an email.
We did.
And they
They
said,
got back to us.
and they got back to us, and they said, yeah, it's wrong. We said thanks. We can talk more about that after. Anyhow, so when we fit our model, we also have to do a bunch of other statistical optimizations on top of our original optimization to get it to work correctly. So the dark blue is my fit, which is pretty good. There's still a couple small things that bother me that will be just forever. I'll be chasing that like extra 2% of accuracy for the rest of my life, but works pretty well. And we did it again for 2016, went through the same process, and we get a comparable sort of fit. And very recently, we've done it for 2017 as well, though 2017 presents some additional problems because the US is exporting more and more oil, and it just meant that I had to go back and build some extra things into my model. But it's going pretty good. Okay. So after we fit our model to make sure that it's working correctly, it sort of reduces the error on our predicted flows along each of those arcs, and it cuts it down by about half. So now that we have a model that is predicting trade flows between each of these regions, we can talk about getting at the marginal effect. So where does the marginal barrel go? So yeah, where's the last barrel of Alberta's production go? What does that mean for the market? What does it mean for prices? So I created these slides using the fit from the 2015 model. So when Alberta produces one additional barrel, we're doing it on heavy. It appears in Alberta, of course. And anybody, I'm going to ask Naomi, where do you think the marginal barrel goes along its first?
Are we talking 2015 or
2015, yeah. Reach back.
I would probably think rail.
No. Close. Huh? Yeah. So first leg is goes by pipeline to pad 2, but it's not processed in pad 2. Travels past pad 2 and is processed in pad 3. The cool thing about this sort of network flow model, though, is that we can look at the marginal effect from a single barrel of heavy, but when that barrel goes into the system that we've built, it creates all sorts of contemporaneous effects, because there's a trade-off between sending a barrel through a pipeline or sending a light barrel through that pipeline. And I'm not going to talk about those effects beyond the fact that they exist, and it's interesting. So the use cases for this sort of model are we want to analyze the market effects of changes in pipelines and transportation, as I said, changes in refinery demand. So I imagine a case where we want to know what's going to happen during turnaround season. Changes in supply, like I mentioned, if Alberta catches on fire. And this is both sort of long-term and I think month-to-month. I think that probably this model has a sweet spot in the 5 or 6 month range, and depending on your assumptions and your data inputs, which we've been working through recently to come up with a longer-term case to evaluate the impacts of TMX, you can use it in long-term sense as well. Next steps, exports, we already fixed that. Revalidation, we also already fixed that. So we're really working on these pipeline scenarios at this point.
Yeah, so I think kind of maybe two things. We always get asked this is one, what is the interest of the university working with Dark Horse to build this model? I mean, I think for us as the university, one of the things I would say is we benefit from being this independent party, right? We're not a lobby group, we're not the government, we're not industry. So it would be a good place for us to do something like run the TMX scenario, figure out what happens to flows, figure out what happens to differentials, and then publish something like that that everyone has access to. That's really the goal. And then your goal is very different, it's commercialization of the model, right? And so we've run it with scenarios already. So we, after Hurricane Harvey, we were like, well, what happens if another hurricane hits and now we've got different data? What's the result of that? Or what was the other example that we said? Oh yeah, with Keystone, when Keystone 1 went down because it had the leak, then we said, okay, what's the impact of that and how quickly can that occur? Right, and then we have really good conversations with people. We're like, well, the model says, go to rail, which is intuitively what you and I would also say. But then, you can physically push back and say, well, logistically, that's challenging that you have to now get cars, figure out what CN and CP want to do, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's a good place to start to try and figure out what is going to happen to flows, right? If the US becomes over 11 million barrels a day while we're growing, while we still don't have market access, where are those barrels going to go, right? So I think those are good questions that we still need to answer.
And that's it.
Thanks very much, Greg. It's time for a couple questions.
Yeah, just on your model, when you talked about optimizing, I didn't fully catch or maybe understand. What is it that you're targeting? Are you targeting maximum net back for the producers in Canada, minimizing cost for the whole?
It's an industry level profit maximization.
So we're
not looking at only Alberta or only any in particular region. We're looking at everyone at once.
So given the cost.
So yeah, so when a barrel travels from point A to point B, in our system, it costs money. And when a barrel goes from point B into demand at point B, it creates revenue. So those are the two elements that all barrels in the system are assigned.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was wondering, what sort of tools are you using to build this model?
Yeah, so originally I built it in when it was a crude model of oil trading, it was just an Excel model. As we added more and more elements to it, it quickly grew outside of that because I needed to be able to pull more levers than I could in Excel. So I coded it in a math programming language that's called Apple. And then some of the additional sort of statistical analysis and optimization on top of that main model I do in R. So it's a combination of three things. The front end, I still, all of my data and all of the sort of assumptions that I make, I still have an Excel file that I use, and then I send it off to other things.
So what is the optimizer? An LP model? Is it a nonlinear?
So there are two elements to it. It's linear underneath, and then on top of that, I have it's a really big nonlinear problem to get it to fit.
He calls it the secret sauce.
It's my secret sauce. I can reveal it to you.
Are you sure? Because we're building it.
I know, I'm a
Yes,
pushover.
we know.
We can talk about it. Any other questions?
Sorry, that 1 million barrels difference that you went to, what percentage off or gap was that?
So I mean, in the U.S., they're producing just a little under 10 million. So that's like a lot.
It's huge.
Missing. Yeah, it's crazy.
From a global standpoint, that's huge.
Yeah.
That was the market imbalance that
Yes.
in 2014 tipped us into
$40.
so that's huge.
Yes.
But I mean, there's some issues around, I always give credit that EIA is very transparent, but even they will admit that, with the condensate that's coming out of gas fields, right, it's not being counted as like a light crude, that then eventually ends up in that stream, and that's where some of the disconnect. And so they admit that it doesn't quite balance. That's where the issue is, which is kind of what we came to as a supply issue. So we're adjusting accordingly.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for those of you who attended. Thanks again to our friends at Deloitte for sponsoring the event. And we are having one more this season coming, I believe the date is May 26th-ish, May 26th. High noon here again. Sign up to receive notifications once the speakers are finalized. The topic we're looking at is data visualization and information design. So if you're interested in that, we're certainly still looking for 1 or 2 more speakers for that event. If you can talk competently to that, beyond what you just read in a book, that would be great. And come talk to me. And I'd love to see what we can do for that. And finally, we always do this. Is there anyone here who is hiring people with analytical capabilities? You're looking to hire analysts, okay? I see one hand here and one at the back. Just 10 seconds, 20 seconds. What are you looking for, Stovall?
Broad range. Data scientists, developers, visualization experts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Stovall is with PwC, and you can come talk to him. And at the back, Carrie.
Yeah, any range from, you talked about data visualization, data wranglers, data scientists. I'm trying to build our practice out west.
Okay. And those who are looking for jobs, just a quick wave of the hand. All right, so there's a few. Yeah, maybe you guys can chat at the end here and look at this. The market clears when we're done. Okay. Yes.
The May session, is that oil and gas themed as well?
It is not oil and gas themed, but it will probably end up being a little bit oil and gas themed given where we're at. But we're trying to keep it not just on the energy specific. So data visualization, May 26th, and then we'll take a break for the summer. We're still looking for sponsors, perhaps, for the May one. I have a few who have mentioned interest in that. And if there's enough interest, and by interest, I'm looking for people who want to help coordinate, to help plan events and look for speakers. If you're interested in that, come talk to me. And if you guys like this, it seems so far we've packed out the room a couple times that this might have some momentum, and we'll kind of kick it off for next year, starting September as well. So thanks again for those of you who have joined us again, and those online, the thousands who are watching this via YouTube. We'll see you again in May. Take care. Thanks,